Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that really peels back the layers of our everyday, mundane reality. We're looking at a deeply fascinating theoretical arc from our source material, the transformation of raw violence into property. It's a journey into the absolute bedrock of civilization, showing how unbridled power somehow, eventually, turns into the quiet, perfectly normal reality of owning things.
Right, let's jump straight in with a question that totally flips our everyday assumptions on their head. What is the actual difference between theft and property? I mean, most of us just assume these are complete opposites, right? One's a crime, the other is literally the foundation of a stable society. But as we're going to see, the line separating the two is way more blurry than we usually like to admit.
Our source text draws this absolutely wild distinction. It points out that what we call a crime when one person does it is magically recorded as triumphant, glorious history when a whole group does it and manages to establish authority. Think about it. Theft is unlawfully taking someone's stuff. But seizure, the taking of huge tracts of land, natural resources, dominating entire populations, well, if the conquerors actually pull it off, it's not called theft. It becomes the founding chapter of a brand new society. You steal a car, you go to jail. You steal a whole continent, you get a holiday named after you. The whole moral character of the act just flips, based entirely on the scale and, well, the success of the taking.
To map out exactly how this evolution happens, we're going to trace it through 5 clear stages. Number 1, the first form of force. 2, war and military origins. 3, territory and the state. 4, when violence becomes property. And finally, 5, borders and spatial exclusion.
Starting off with Section 1, the first form of force. Force as the act of taking.
So let's look at the absolute ground floor of political order. It doesn't begin with a constitution or a law. It begins with the raw capacity to just make people obey. The SARS defines this foundational moment as seizure. This is the very first layer of the architecture of force, way before any courts or institutions even exist. It happens when a group just claims possession of something, and they secure that claim entirely through the threat or use of violence. This isn't some abstract theory. It's the physical, literal imposition of will. It's that exact spark where violence stops being just a random fight and turns into the bedrock of long-term control. What's super interesting here is how this maps the entire trajectory of the text's thesis. You can see exactly how an episodic, messy conflict morphs into a permanent system. We start at step 1, raw violence. Once that violence works, it sets up a rule, which is step 2. Give it enough time, and that rule hardens into an institution. And finally, those institutions interlock to create a total system. For this explainer, though, we're zeroing in on that very first, crucial domino, the initial violence that kicks off the whole chain reaction. Moving on to Section 2, war and military origins. Organizing foundational violence. Okay, so how did this initial seizure actually look back in human history? Well, the very first political communities didn't start with parliaments or bureaucrats. No way. They started as groups that were just really, really good at organizing violence to dominate a territory. We're talking about early warbands, hunters who basically transitioned their skill sets into becoming warriors, charismatic warlords who could rally fighters, and raiding societies. The main way that sudden seizure turned into durable rule was simply through a retinue of fighters. It was martial organization, pure and simple. Take a look at this brutally honest quote from the source material. The history of political order, therefore, begins not with law, but with acts of appropriation backed by the threat or use of force. It's a heavy reminder that underneath all the polite, sanitized language of our modern world, there's just the raw reality of a victor's capacity to take and hold. Every single political order today, no matter how refined it seems, traces back to some initial act of appropriation. Somebody at some point drew a line in the dirt and had the physical muscle to back it up. Which naturally leads us to wonder, how does a roaming warband actually turn into a recognized government? That brings us to Section 3, territory and the state, spatial control and legitimate force.
Using Max Weber's concept of authority, we can really visualize the psychological shift that happens to a population over time. Look at year 1 of a conquest. The subjugated people obey, but they're doing it purely out of terror. Fast forward to decade 1, though, and that fear is kind of settled into a routine. It's just a habit of daily life now. By century 1, the descendants of both the conquerors and the conquered don't even question it. They view the whole setup as totally legitimate. The initial trauma fades away, and the hierarchy they're left with is just accepted as the natural order of the universe.
The absolute gut punch of a takeaway here is this. Civilization is not the absence of violence. Not at all.
It is the organization of violence. The state really emerges when acts of conquest get stable enough that force can be organized across a specific population. The warlord essentially just puts on a suit and becomes the sovereign.
Which leads us to our core focus in Section 4, when violence becomes property, the legal recognition of conquest.
Now we're at the exact spot where the theoretical rubber meets the road, where violence is actually codified into property. Before getting into the dry legal structures, the text uses this incredibly powerful, almost poetic language. This is conquest. This is primitive accumulation. This is the open wound. It's an intense reminder that our neat property lines are basically just healed-over scars of ancient occupations. Those serene parks, the fenced-in suburban yards, the perfect city grids, they are the direct historical descendants of a massive expropriation.
This outlines the step-by-step transformation brilliantly. First, conquest physically seizes the land. Boom. Second, to lock that down, the land is turned into titled property. Third, that newly minted property enters the market. It becomes a commodity. Fourth, that commodification serves as the engine for capital accumulation. And finally, step 5, to protect all that accumulated capital, you absolutely need an enforcer, which loops us right back to the state's monopoly on force. It's just this incredible architectural bridge linking ancient, bloody conquest directly to modern economics.
And pay attention to how language plays a role here in naturalizing that domination. When conquerors win, they literally rename the world to sanitize what they did. They trade the gritty, brutal vocabulary of the battlefield, words like violence, blood, warlords, for the polite, respectable language of the courtroom. Once they're in charge, they talk about property, law, and administration. It's like the ultimate PR spin, perfectly hiding the original violent seizure under layers of institutional respectability. Finally, let's check out Section 5, Borders and Spatial Exclusion, enforcing the original seizure. So how does this whole system finalize its control on a map? According to the source, a territory only exists because someone successfully drew boundaries and kept up enough sustained violence to stop anyone else from crossing them. A border isn't just a line drawn on paper. It's the physical, legal manifestation of that very first act of seizure. It is the spatial logic of exclusion. By throwing up a border, the state is basically building a giant protective fence around its foundational act of violence, deciding who gets the privilege of being a citizen on the inside and who is kept out. Looking at the full overarching framework of the source text, it exposes this totally cyclical nature of power. Think about it. Once you take land through seizure, that's mode I, you are forced to build institutions to maintain it through management, which is mode 2. And because that initial taking almost definitely displaced somebody else, eventually you're going to have to defend it through suppression, or mode 3. The conquest doesn't actually end, it just changes its shape. We're going to leave you with this final, highly provocative thought from the text to chew on the next time you look at a world map or even your own property deed. If the absolute bedrock of our civilized institutions is built on ancient acts of violent seizure, at what exact moment does that violence magically transform into legitimate, unquestionable law?